Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this discussion. Let's eat cookies and talk about grief and hope. I'm Kim Moldofsky, and I'm here with Carol Smith. Carol is an award-winning journalist and editor for the NPR affiliate KUOW in Seattle. Previously, she worked for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Los Angeles Times. Her essays and other writings have appeared in more than a dozen literary journals. Her memoir, Crossing the River, 7 Stories That Saved My Life, came out in 2021 from Abrams Press in New York. It's about coming to terms with the unexpected loss of her 7-year-old son and the 7 people who unwittingly helped her on a journey to heal. Thank you so much for being here, Carol. I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you.
I want to start with a quote from your book. Like me, you suffered the sudden and traumatic loss of a child who was away from home. You lost a 7-year-old son due to fast developing medical issues, and I lost a 21-year-old son to suicide. You wrote, "Loss is such a weak word. The soft sibilance of its final S's vanishing wisp-like into the ether. Its definition is, quote, a failure to hold, as though loss were like letting go of a balloon, a gentle disappearance. But the word itself derives from the ancient root lu, meaning to cut apart. This is what loss felt like to me." And yes, I was like, yes, this woman gets traumatic loss and deep grief. 2 years into the pandemic, it feels like everyone is grieving something or someone, loved ones, missed opportunities, a way of life. And as you said in an interview that I read, as we search for news that might change the outcome, but have, quote, the sinking realization that control has slipped from our grasp, the sense of dislocation, the daily struggle to breathe, all of these perfectly mirror feelings of grief. So I want to present you with a question you asked in your book, with a line that took my breath away. How do you survive grief when it's more like an infinite loop of a Mobius strip, when there is no end in sight?
That is the question, isn't it? And it is really one that so many people have to face at some point in their lives. I don't know. It's interesting because some of you may have seen that just recently the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, officially designated prolonged grief disorder as a diagnosis. And there's been, a lot of discussion and a little bit of controversy over the years about whether, long-term grief should be pathologized, whether it's a disease, and I think the nerve it struck is that one of the criteria to be prolonged is that you experience like deep yearning or profound sadness more than a year after the loss. And I don't know about you, but for anybody that I know who's experienced a deep loss, and even, and that could be a pet for some people who it's, a companion, but for people who've lost a dear one, it doesn't end at a year. So I think for me, one of that it will recur and it will loop around. That's where this sort of image came to my mind about the Mobius strip. And for me, in terms of being able to live with it and survive and go forward and have a meaningful life, it was recognizing that it was going to recur and it was going to keep going on, and it wasn't something that was going to end one day. And so I think that for me, that has been the secret, is just recognizing the nature of it. And then over time, learning to, recognize the things that triggered me, the things that might cause it to bubble back up for me. And it's interesting because, a lot of people talk about, and I experience it too, significant anniversaries can be triggers, but often I experience it more in the leading up. And so, there's this kind of, I'll get this sense that things don't feel right. We have this kind of restless, displaced energy. I won't be sleeping well, and I won't connect it at all to grief. And then I'll look at the calendar and realize, oh, it's just turned December and that's the month, So,
Yeah. Yeah, like the saying that your body knows. Our grief therapist would often say that your body knows. And yeah, it's like something's not right, you're easily agitated, you're not sleeping, and then the calendar kind of clues you in as to why that's happening. I also, going back to what you were saying about the year and the APA, I hadn't read the guidelines. I knew that there was this change afoot. But I think that's really unfortunate to look at the year mark, because the second year for me was really hard. And I've heard that from other people. And that first year, everything is new and different. But that second year, you're really kind of settling into this reality. And it's very challenging.
exactly. And I think in that first year, at least for me, I was in shock. I mean, I think your body only lets you experience something this enormous a little bit at a time. And I think, people see you and you don't even seem to be, quote, that bad off, and so they sort of assume that you're moving through it fine. And then you're right. I mean, for me, it was very classically, the second year was hard, and then the third year was hard, because by then the people that had been sort of there to hold you up, they start to go back to their own lives. And so, yeah, I don't think a year is a good framing for it.
Yeah, for sure.
I do think that the benefit of having it, and the visibility of having it be a diagnosis in the DSM, is that people will just realize that it is a thing that happens, and that they will maybe look around to people in their lives and recognize more of the signs that there is grief affecting their friends and their loved ones' lives on an ongoing basis. So that awareness part of it, I think, is a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So
I was going to go on to the next one, unless you want to add.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing. So in terms of like getting through it, once you do kind of know your triggers, for me, I then had a little set of things that I did to take care of myself, to go for walks and reach out to some friends that I feels really safe to talk about this stuff with. So I'd reach out to them. So I did better over time taking care of myself when I would feel the hard feelings.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what else is in your toolkit, your self-care toolkit.
I listen to music. I find journaling tremendously helpful. Even if I'm not writing specifically about those feelings, just the fact that I somehow, that for me, the physical act of writing is very grounding. So those are the main tools: walking, journaling, talking to friends. Yeah.
Yeah. I think walking, or any movement of your body. A friend of mine says movement produces movement. And
Yes.
and that was one of my pandemic hobbies, has been really upping my exercise routine. And that is not driven by diet, but purely driven by mental health needs, that I found that really helped.
Yeah, exactly.
So another thing that can help is a support group. And you really talk in your book about, you got connected with one, but were really kind of on the outside of it for a long time. Tell us about how I want to talk specifically, I want to hear about your group, but I also want to hear about this balance, especially when it comes to, in my experience, like the suicide groups or the child loss groups. You go and you can get so much support, but you're also exposed to a lot of trauma from other people. So how did you kind of balance that out? Or it was something that happened over time? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I had that same experience, and I reached out to a support group early on, and I remember being completely overwhelmed by all the pain in the room, and just it shut me down. It was just like I couldn't, it was really triggering for me. And I felt like I remember almost like this out of body experience, like I need to be anywhere but here. So I was of no value to anybody in the group. And it, so it, and it wasn't helpful for me at that time. I think it was just a few years out, or even sooner than that. And so and that was specifically a group for mothers who'd lost kids. And so I sort of turned instead to books, and I read a lot of grief books and memoir, and I found that really helpful because I could do it in my own time and my own pace. And just seeing that people, how other people got through, and I would recognize my own feelings in what they wrote. That was really helpful. And then eventually I tried the same group again. It's run by a wonderful woman. She's a former hospice nurse, I think. And and then at that point I was maybe 10 or 12 years out, and I was much more able to manage my feelings. And in that case, it was super helpful for me because I could learn from people who were, further along than I was. And I also felt like I was able to give something back to people who were newer in their grief. And so it felt really good. I got a lot out of it. So for me, it was like the right timing and the right group. So yeah, and just a little, right after it happened, this isn't a support group, but the hospital sent like a student social worker out to my house, and who I think I probably was her first case of a bereavement, and she was terrified and couldn't talk, couldn't say the word death or died. And so we just, I felt really frankly, I felt like a freak. I felt like, oh my God, I've really this is not something you can talk about. And it's just awful, and which it was, all of that. But I've since learned and encountered so many wonderful people in the grief support world that, so if I had any advice for people, it would be like, try a few times to find the fit. And if it doesn't feel right, don't make yourself go. So, and it was interesting because I went back. So I've been to that group now at 3 different junctures, and I went back. I think in the last year I was writing the book, and again found it really, really helpful. So, and there the nurse who runs it, she said, sometimes I felt like I didn't want to talk because I was in a really different place, and I didn't want to feel like the fact that I had where I was it all going to minimize what other people were going through. And she said, you don't have to say anything. Just the fact that you're there can feel comforting to people, to see that someone can, that you survive. I mean,
You survive.
It's survival. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I agree about just knowing someone who's been through this can be just tremendously supportive. And I found that even if I didn't talk to them, just knowing, okay, here's this person I know and they've been through this, and that was comforting for me. And I try to be there for others too, but recognizing that we're each going to have our own journey, and that my journey is really still pretty new. So yeah, the Mobius strip.
Yeah, it really changes your perception of time too. I mean, it's been 27 years now, which I can't even believe that when I say that, because it feels in many moments like it was just yesterday.
Yeah.
And then there are other moments when I look at how different my life is, and I could see the passage of time. So.
Yeah, and I mentioned that too when we first talked, because now there's always such an immediacy about life, and you read a memoir, a year after a person experienced something, or a few years after that, it wasn't until you mentioned ultrasounds not being a routine part of pregnancy that I realized, like, oh, this happened a while ago, and it really got me thinking about time and processing and the just the cycle and the time. I mean, I'm resolved in that this isn't something that I will resolve in my lifetime. You know, my grief will always be there, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but it's not like, okay, I'm done, you know?
No,
Um, yeah.
yeah.
So speaking, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I got that question a little bit initially about the book, like why did it quote take you so long to write the book? And for me, there was so much, there was a lot of value in the books I read from people who wrote, like in the 5-year out kind of time frame. That was super helpful. But the book that I didn't see was the one that showed me what my life might look like down the road. How do I integrate this? And so I didn't have that long view. And I remember in the beginning, somebody said to me, right after it happened, your life as you know it is over. And what I heard though was your life is over. And what I needed to hear, or what I needed, and what I hope this does for some other people is that your life will go on, and you will hopefully it integrates into your life in a way that provides meaning for you. So yeah. And I don't look to like the tragedy itself as, for the meaning. It's like, it's the living with it, and how does it sort of shape your worldview in ways that feel meaningful to you. So yeah.
Yeah, and can you talk about that more? How grief reframed your life and took you forward? What, like, immediate changes, or looking back, are there changes that you realize were related to the grief, but maybe you didn't recognize that at the time?
Yeah, I think when I started to realize that it really had changed me sort of fundamentally. It's funny, maybe it's not funny, but it's funny now. But after my son died and I was divorced, and it took a lot of years, but after a while I did start going out again. And if someone asked, and I had a few of those sort of clarifying experiences where you suddenly realize who you want to be surrounding yourself with, and what kind of life you want to be living. And it was sort of in response to minor kind of trivial things, like, someone would be rude to a server, or they would freak out over something that I didn't consider important, which, it's all in the eye of the beholder, but still it really, it made me see how much my own experience with grief had changed me and made me much more intentional about how I wanted to spend my time. So I spent more time with my family. I consciously, more intentionally made an effort with my circle of friends. My circle of friends had shrunk, not because I withdrew for the first 10 years. I just kind of shut down, and just, I went to work and I powered through. But I really, as I came out of that shell, I really wanted to spend it with people who mattered to me. So yeah, that, and then I think I was a journalist before. I was a journalist when he was born, but what changed over time after he died is that I became much more intentional about those kinds of stories that I wanted to tell and report on, and it mattered to me that they make a difference in people's lives. And it mattered to me, it became sort of my own personal calling, that to help other people tell stories. So for a while there, I was working with like a group of, we have a program where we help high school students tell their first radio features. And it was so wonderful to see what happened for them when they told their stories. And I really believe in that power, that like sharing what has happened to you and listening to what has happened to other people and framing them as stories really can be very healing. So that became that was definitely a change, a shift for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you got to do some amazing reporting. I mean, based on the stories that are in the book. Can you tell us a little bit about one of the stories, maybe?
Um, sure. I'll talk about the personal one because I think you had asked, but I write about my grandmother. Most of that's the outlier because the others are all people that were strangers to me when we met.
But you did also write about her in the paper, right?
Yes, I did.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
okay.
And I had written her story. So my grandmother was a nurse in World War I, and she was part of the first group of women to serve in the military. And she was posted to France, and she worked in one of the MASH units. You know, the tent hospitals right behind the trench line. And so they were the first station, the triage station. And she didn't talk about this experience until she was in her 90s and I was in my 30s. And, and, you know, I had grown up admiring her and recognizing her self-reliance and how strong she was. And she was a big source of strength for me in the early days when Chris was born, and he was born with a lot of health issues. So, but just a little digression. I was so worried when he was born. He was her first great grandchild, and I thought it's just gonna kill her that he's so fragile and he might die. And how am I going to tell her this? You know, it's going to be so hard for her. And she just was, she just embraced it. And I kind of watched how you just dealt with what you dealt with. So I didn't realize until I was, an adult that where that kind of strength came from for her. So being able to tell her story in the paper and then later in the book was really, really meaningful for me. And it was one of the stories that I got the most response to at the paper. It just like so many people had relatives who hadn't talked about a trauma, and especially who had been through various of the wars. So anyway, that was really, it was really meaningful for me.
And I have a note. Can you talk about the picture, the ex-boyfriend's picture?
Oh,
She
yeah.
was like 100 when she burned it or something. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. That, I didn't, my aunt told me that. So um, my grandmother, when she was a nurse and she was at the training camp, met a young lieutenant, and he was her first love and her first boyfriend, and they went off to France, together, and they rode and so forth. And then when after the armistice, they reconnected in Paris, but he didn't completely respond to her. It's almost like he didn't recognize her. And she only realized later that it was the shell shock. But she was so taken aback, that she returned the little service pen that he had given to her. And it really, it broke her heart. So, and then she came back and she married my grandfather, and I'm here. So, but apparently she kept a photo of that lieutenant until she was 100, and then she apparently burned it, my aunt said. And I think what I took away from that is it kind of takes as long as it takes to let something completely go. It may have been much more practical than that. She just didn't want to leave any questions, for us behind. But I do think that clearly he mattered to her. He talked about her. He talked about her. She talked about him with me, and it was sort of her coming of age, I think. So it's a significant loss in the love in her life. But yeah, it takes as long as it takes to process things.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to move on to hope. And there's a couple things. Okay, so there's a woman named Miriam Kaba who is actually a prison abolitionist, and she said, I would feel overwhelmed by when I was feeling overwhelmed by what was going on in the world. I would just say to myself, hope is a discipline. And First Lady Michelle Obama wrote in her book that feeling that failure was a feeling before it was an actuality. That is, we talk ourselves out of things before we do our best to make them happen. Do you feel like the opposite is true for hope, that maybe we need to look at it like a discipline, or we need to talk ourselves into it?
I love that idea. And yes, I do. I think that I had um, a misconception about, for me, was a misperception about hope. And especially early on, I kept wanting people to give me hope. I,
Mm.
when Chris was in the hospital, my son, a lot, I was always looking to the doctors, for hope. And I finally realized that nobody can give it to you. You have to find it in yourself. And but that you can learn it. You can learn it by observing other people. And so that was actually one of the guiding kind of principles for me in my reporting. I was basically looking for that by going out and reporting out these stories of people who I knew I could learn something from. So yeah, I do think it's like a muscle. And I realized that, sort of along the way, that hope has more to do with, I can't remember where this comes from. It's not original to me, but the idea that hope is understanding that there's always a different path forward. So if one path is blocked, and you have to have the discipline to try another way, as opposed to thinking this didn't work, it's just there's no other way forward. And I found that really comforting, sort of, and I could see it at work in other people's lives. This didn't this isn't what you would have written for yourself, or this isn't the script that you were going by, but you're going to have to readjust and find a different path around. So yeah, I do. I like that notion, that the way you put it, that it is a discipline. Hope is a discipline.
And that's interesting. And I think that kind of takes us full circle, that here we are a couple of years into this pandemic, which I follow a little too closely on Twitter to be optimistic about right now. And that, we're all, in the last couple of years, we've all been thrown these unexpected obstacles, and the script has been ripped up, and where are we now? Hopefully we're getting out of bed and we're putting one foot in front of the other. But I love how purposefully you sought out those stories, and how they really did save your life. I mean, they really did help you put a new script together. That's amazing. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Someone shared Emily Dickinson's quote, "Hope is a thing with feathers." Bev, I think you did that. Oh, okay, here. There is a question here. Okay, the question is, I'm curious about where your faith or religion / belief, or not, in God came in during this time. Is spirituality a part of your life now?
Um,
Great question. Thank you.
yeah. I think that I grew up in a Protestant tradition, but sort of like a lot of people, kind of incorporated my own sort of form of spirituality as I went along. So I didn't have like a faith community, or a set of traditional faith practices, but I've always felt very connected to something larger than myself. And so that was a source of comfort, and knowing that there's a bigger world out there than just me and my pain. And I think one of the things, I don't know that this is, it is, I guess for me, it was a sort of form of spirituality. I remember thinking in the beginning that nobody else could possibly feel the pain I was in. And it was truly a humbling thing to open my eyes and see how many people experienced the pain that I was in. And that I felt suddenly, weirdly, I felt so connected to people in a way I hadn't before. And I think that I'm going to get kind of emotional, but I mean, to me, that was a very spiritual awakening. So yeah. And I remember there was and I talk a little bit about this. One of the stories in the book is a little boy who had progeria, and so he and his family both knew, that he wasn't going to grow to be a young adult. And I remember one of the things I was really struggling with early in my grief was feeling like I hadn't prepared my son, who was deaf. I hadn't ever talked to him about death, and I was not there when he died, and I was so afraid that he was afraid. And I remember wishing I had been able to tell him that, like, heaven is a place you go in your heart. And in the course of following this other young boy for a year in his life, I realized that children view death differently than we do, and it was very helpful. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There might be time for one more question if anyone wants to put something in chat. Oh, and Beverly shared the whole quote. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Thanks, Bev.
That's beautiful. That's one of my favorites. I love that. I am looking at the chat, and somebody asked if I have other children, and I don't. I had several miscarriages afterwards, and then I decided I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, last chance. That must have gone right to you because I don't see that. But all right. If there are no questions, I just want to thank you very much for your time, and want to remind everyone that your book, Crossing the River, 7 Stories That Saved My Life, is out now and will be coming out in paperback in about a month at the end of May. Thank you. Oh, there's some thank yous coming in on chat.